Maureen, and for the next hour, I'll be reading from the January 14th, 2026 issue of the Wall Street Journal on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Thank you for joining us today. The highlights under business and finance are: inflation remained relatively contained at the close of 2025, despite turbulence from tariffs, giving the Fed some leeway as it weighs the threat of price pressures against a cooling labor market. Major U.S. stock indexes fell, with the S&P 500, Dow, and NASDAQ shedding 0.2%, 0.8%, and 0.1% respectively. Netflix is preparing to make its bid for Warner Brothers Discovery Studios and HBO Max streaming business, all cash, as Paramount continues to push its competing offer. The former chief of Neiman Marcus was tapped to steer Saks Global through its expected bankruptcy proceedings as its new chief executive. J.P. Morgan Chase reported a 7% fall in quarterly profit, a result hurt by a charge from its deal to assume Apple's credit card program and a slip in investment banking fees. BNY's chief executive criticized the Trump administration's pressure on the Fed in a call that came after the bank reported record revenue for 2025. OpenAI is expected to air a Super Bowl ad for a second straight year, amplifying its call for users as rival artificial intelligence companies gain ground. Percepta, an AI company launched by two ex-Palantir employees and owned by General Catalyst, denied Palantir claims that it violated non-compete agreements. Delta said it expects to boost its profit this year from ticket sales in first and business class and reported stronger operating revenue for the latest quarter. Now for the key articles under the Worldwide section. Trump criticized a group of U.S. attorneys at a White House event, calling them weak and complaining they weren't moving fast enough to prosecute his chosen targets. At least 6 prosecutors resigned from the U.S. Attorney's Office in Minnesota over the Trump administration's handling of the federal investigation into the killing of a woman by an ICE agent. Trump twice told Iranians protesting against their government that help was on the way, in a sign the U.S. may soon act against the regime. Iran's Arab rivals across the Persian Gulf, led by Saudi Arabia, are lobbying the Trump administration against a strike on Tehran. The Supreme Court appeared inclined to uphold state laws banning transgender women and girls from competing in female sports events. The Trump administration will announce Wednesday the U.S. is moving to the next step of its Gaza plan and name a committee of Palestinians to temporarily run the bombed-out enclave. Greenland's leader said if his people were asked to choose here and now, they would opt to remain a Danish territory rather than join the U.S. A Justice Department memo asserted that the Venezuela opposition support for U.S. action to oust strongman Nicolas Maduro helped Trump's legal case to overthrow him. A top House Republican said he would move to hold Bill Clinton in contempt of Congress after the former president didn't appear to give a deposition related to an Epstein investigation. Vanderbilt University plans to open a campus near downtown San Francisco to accommodate 1,000 full-time students and 100 faculty. Japan and South Korea reaffirmed their ties with a meeting of their leaders in Nara Prefecture amid rising economic, technological, and military pressure from China. Far-right leader Marine Le Pen denied wrongdoing as she appeared in a French court to appeal an embezzlement conviction. The picture on the front page today shows Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell walking down the sidewalk. And that caption reads, Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell, whose testimony about building renovations was the subject of federal grand jury subpoenas sent last week, arrived at the central bank Tuesday. The article, Trump presses prosecutors to target foes. U.S. attorneys told at White House event that cases aren't moving fast enough. By Sadie Gurman, C. Ryan Barber, and Josh Dawsey, Washington. President Trump criticized a group of U.S. attorneys at a White House event last week, calling them weak and complaining they weren't moving fast enough to prosecute his favored targets, according to people familiar with the exchange. Dozens of U.S. attorneys whose lead prosecutors' offices around the country went to the White House Thursday for what was supposed to be a ceremonial photo shoot. After Attorney General Pam Bondi introduced the group of prosecutors, Trump criticized them as ineffective, saying the group was making it difficult for Bondi and Deputy Attorney General Todd Blanche to do their jobs, the people said. The exchange came a day before federal prosecutors sent grand jury subpoenas to the Federal Reserve on Friday, related to Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell's testimony last summer about the central bank's building renovation project. Jeanine Pirro, the U.S. Attorney for the District of Columbia, who was in attendance at the White House event, wrote in a social media post Monday that the Fed subpoenas came after her office hadn't gotten answers to multiple information requests. The inquiry opened in November. A lawyer in Pirro's office sent 2 emails to the Fed last month, one before Christmas and another 10 days later, seeking information about the renovation, a person familiar with the matter said. The emails didn't refer to any deadline or criminal investigation. None of this would have happened if they had just responded to our outreach, Pirro wrote in the Post. This office makes decisions based on the merits, nothing more and nothing less. The Justice Department referred questions to the White House, which didn't respond to requests for comment. Powell, in a video statement posted online Sunday, called the probe politically motivated. A Fed representative declined to comment. White House's moves jolt longtime Wall Street allies, by Gregory Zuckerman. Wall Street thought it had an ally in Donald Trump. He's becoming more of an adversary. The president largely delivered to investors last year as his administration cut taxes, reduced spending, and rolled back an aggressive tariff plan after it spooked markets. Now, after blindsiding Wall Street with a series of rapid-fire moves in the span of a week, President Trump appears to be putting it on notice. He has sought to block large investors from buying houses, called for a cap on credit card rates, and announced restrictions on executive pay and stock buybacks. Then came the most stunning move of all, the Justice Department's criminal investigation of Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell in what he said was an intimidation tactic to lower interest rate. Investors thought after the April 2025 tariffs that uncertainty around policy would magically go away, said Brad Golding, a hedge fund manager at Christopherson, Robb and Company in New York. Now we're seeing that midterm elections mean more than the profitability of banks and the stability of markets. News of the investigation, which prompted J.P. Morgan Chase chief executive Jamie Dimon and others in the banking world to defend the Fed, was an escalation in Trump's pressure campaign on the Fed to lower rates. It was a clear message that voters' concerns about the cost of living and not investors are now top of mind. On Monday evening, Trump, a Republican, issued his latest broadside against business on social media, said he was working with Microsoft and other tech giants to make sure consumers don't pick up the tab for higher electricity prices as heavy investment in artificial intelligence fuels power demand from data centers. White House spokesman Kush Desai said in a statement that multiple record stock market highs and rising real wages show Trump can unleash historic prosperity for consumers and investors. Investors can't say they weren't warned. Members of the administration have spent over a year saying they were going to try to help consumers and others, even at the expense of investors. For the last 4 decades, Wall Street has grown wealthier than ever before. For the next 4 years, it's Main Street's turn, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent told a group of bankers last April. Investors are bracing for the next surprise from Trump that could drive stock moves. His administration has indicated more affordability proposals could be unveiled when he appears at the World Economic Forum next week. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the Wall Street Journal on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. In Pivot, President rolls out proposals to tackle affordability by Rachel Louise Ensign and Ken Thomas. President Trump surprised Senator Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts on Monday with a phone call after she criticized him during a speech on affordability. Only days earlier, he had pitched a cap on credit card rates that sounded like a proposal from the Democratic senator's wish list. I told him that Congress can pass legislation to cap credit card rates if he will actually fight for it, Warren said. Until recently, Trump, a Republican, has called Democrats' focus on affordability a hoax, but the issue has since taken on urgency in his administration. The president has announced many proposals aimed at gaining more leverage over the economy and the cost of living. He has done it by upsetting Wall Street supporters and pitching ideas more closely associated with liberal Democrats. The president's proposals include banning large investors from buying single-family homes and directing government-backed mortgage finance companies, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, to buy $200 billion in mortgage bonds in an effort to lower rates for home buyers. He has floated using tariff revenue to fund payments of at least $2,000 to most Americans. The president is also drawing up plans to dominate the Venezuelan oil industry, efforts he believes could lower oil prices, the Wall Street Journal reported. On Monday night, he posted on social media that he never wants Americans to pay higher electricity bills because of data centers, and that big tech companies building data centers must pay their own way. The president has touted the U.S. economy as strong, pointed to economic growth and a low unemployment rate, and graded himself A++, on the economy. But he has also expressed frustration in America's extended sour mood about the economy and fixation on high prices. A Fox News poll in mid-December showed the president with a 39% approval rating on the economy, in line with other surveys. Inflation Holds Steady, Giving Fed Breathing Room, by Harriet Torrey. Inflation remained relatively contained at the close of 2025, despite turbulence from tariffs, giving the Federal Reserve some breathing room as it weighs the threat of price pressures against a cooling labor market. Consumer prices rose 2.7% in December from a year earlier, the Labor Department said Tuesday. That was unchanged from November's pace and in line with the expectations of economists surveyed by the Wall Street Journal. Though inflation readings bounced around last year and remain stuck above the 2% rate that policymakers prefer, year-over-year CPI inflation cooled over the course of 2025 to 2.7% in December from 3% in January. The Consumer Price Index report showed the impact of tariffs is still relatively muted. Last spring, a big fear was that President Trump's new tariffs would fuel massive price increases, but some companies have been eating the cost or raising prices only slowly. Tuesday's report also offers a measure of relief to Fed officials who lowered rates last month and have signaled they plan to hold them steady for now. In a year where there was an incredible amount of angst related to tariffs and the potential for upward pressure on that, we're finishing the year in a more benign stance than where we started, said Tom Porcelli, chief economist at Wells Fargo. The December report allows the Fed to start the process of shifting its focus more toward the labor part of the mandate, which is in need of some help right now, Porcelli said. The bank collapse that shook Iran. Bad loans to cronies sank a Hyundai bank, accelerating a financial crisis, by Jared Malzahn. The biggest harbinger that things were about to fall apart in Iran didn't come from the thwarted anger of the country's opposition or the frustrated hopes of young people hungry for personal freedom. It came from the collapse of a bank. Late last year, a Hyundai bank, run by regime cronies and saddled with nearly $5 billion in losses on a pile of bad loans, went bust. The government folded the carcass into a state bank and printed a massive amount of money to paper over all the red ink. That buried the problem, but didn't solve it. Instead, the failure became both a symbol and an accelerant of an economic unraveling that ultimately triggered the protests that now pose the most significant threat to the regime since the founding of the Islamic Republic half a century ago. The bank's collapse made clear that the Iranian financial system, under strain from years of sanctions, bad lending, and reliance on inflationary printed money, had become increasingly insolvent and illiquid. 5 other banks are thought to be similarly weak. The crisis hit at the worst possible time. The Iranian government's credibility had already been battered by a 12-day war with Israel and the U.S. in June that showed it couldn't defend its population from attack. Its leaders had refused to budge in negotiations over the country's nuclear program, putting sanctions relief out of reach. In November, Israel and the U.S. threatened to strike again if Iran tried to reconstitute its ballistic missile arsenal or nuclear efforts. The country's beleaguered currency, the rial, tipped into a new downward spiral the country had little ability to stop. U.S. enforcement actions had cut Iran off from its crucial flow of dollars from Iraq, significantly reduced its hard currency earnings from oil sales, and put its overseas reserves of foreign exchange out of reach with sanctions. After decades of engineering workarounds and using shadowy flows of cash to keep the country's battered economy functioning, Tehran had reached a dead end, with no tools to address a deepening economic crisis or meet the needs of an increasingly desperate population. Hundreds of merchants who don't typically join the country's mass protest took to the streets of Tehran to demand relief. Whatever happens with the protests, the stress on the regime from deep-seated internal financial problems, along with heavy pressure from outside, isn't going away. Trump tells protesters help is on its way. President cancels talks with Tehran after more than 2,000 killed in streets. By Alexander Ward, Laura Segelman, and Benoit Falcon. President Trump on 2 occasions Tuesday told Iranians protesting against their government that help is on its way. The latest sign the U.S. might soon take action against a regime that mounting evidence shows has killed thousands of demonstrators. The message, delivered on social media and in a speech in Detroit, indicated that Trump is poised to intervene in Iran, potentially wading into a confrontation to support an uprising against state repression and flailing economy. He said Americans in Iran should consider evacuating. On board Air Force One on his return to Washington, D.C., Trump said he was expecting a report on the latest situation in Iran and dismissed a threat by the country's leaders to retaliate to a U.S. attack. Pointing out the military destroyed Iran's nuclear capability in an attack in June, he said Iran said that the last time they better behave. In an interview with CBS News, he said the U.S. will take very strong action if the Iranian regime executes anti-government protesters. The death toll in the unrest that began in late December has surpassed 2,000, said human rights activists in Iran. The group said the fatalities include 1,850 protesters and 135 members of Iran's security forces. Arrests totaled 16,784. Trump didn't attend a meeting of senior administration officials Tuesday to discuss his Iran options, White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt said. For now, he has ruled out talks. I have canceled all meetings with Iranian officials until the senseless killing of protesters stops, he said on Truth Social. Trump is leaning toward ordering military strikes, the Wall Street Journal previously reported, but he hasn't made a final decision, officials say. White House to unveil Gaza governance plan by Robbie Gramer, Alexander Ward, and Anat Peled, Washington. The Trump administration will announce Wednesday the U.S. is moving to the next step of its Gaza plan and name a committee of Palestinians to temporarily run the bombed-out enclave, U.S. officials said. Since a fragile ceasefire in Gaza is holding, and Hamas has returned all but one deceased hostage, U.S. officials assess that they can now shift from halting the conflict to governing and rebuilding the territory, which the administration labels Phase 2 of its 20-point blueprint. The plan still faces deep skepticism from some senior Middle Eastern officials as Hamas, designated a terrorist group by the U.S., has yet to detail how, if at all, it plans to disarm under the terms of the ceasefire President Trump brokered last October. The U.S. is expected to announce the names of 15 Palestinian technocrats on the National Committee for the Administration of Gaza, or NCAG, who will be responsible for everyday management of the enclave. Nikolay Mladenov, a former UN envoy for the Middle East peace and Bulgarian foreign minister, will be named as the new High Representative for the Trump-chaired Board of Peace, overseeing the implementation of the peace plan, the U.S. official said. Mladenov will act as the conduit between the panel of Palestinian technocrats and the Board of Peace, officials said. The roughly 12-member Board of Peace will provide high-level direction on matters in Gaza, the U.S. official said. Trump, speaking Sunday to reporters aboard Air Force One, said it would consist of the most important leaders of the most important nations. He has yet to name the members. From World Watch, Ukraine. Russia launches power grid attack. Russia launched a second major drone and missile bombardment of Ukraine in 4 days, officials said on Tuesday, aiming again at the power grid amid freezing temperatures. Russia fired almost 300 drones, 18 ballistic missiles, and 7 cruise missiles at 8 regions overnight, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said on social media. One strike in the northeastern Kharkiv region killed 4 people at a mail depot, and several 100,000 households were without power in the Kyiv region, Zelensky said. France. Le Pen appeals fraud conviction. Far-right leader Marine Le Pen denied wrongdoing as she appeared in court on Tuesday to appeal an embezzlement conviction, with her 2027 presidential ambitions hanging on the outcome of the case. Le Pen, 57 years old, is seeking to overturn a March ruling that found her guilty of misusing European Parliament funds. She was given a 5-year ban from holding elected office, 2 years of house arrest with an electronic bracelet, a further 2-year suspended sentence, and a $116,800 fine. Le Pen had been seen as the potential front-runner to succeed President Emmanuel Macron in the 2027 election. Syria. Government forces, Kurds, trade fire. Government forces and the Kurdish-led Syrian Democratic Forces exchanged fire on Tuesday in a tense area of eastern Aleppo province, marking a possible escalation after days of clashes in the country's largest second city. No casualties were immediately reported, as an impasse continues in negotiations between the central government and the SDF over merging its thousands of fighters into the National Army. Eastern Aleppo province has been a tense front line dividing areas under the Syrian government and swaths of northeastern Syria under the SDF. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the Wall Street Journal on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. From the opinion pages, now lawfare engulfs the Fed. The long road to the latest outrage was paved by elites who didn't speak up. By Holman W. Jenkins, Jr. The ironies of Donald Trump are never ending. Because Mr. Trump is by nature a reacher and overreacher, the next president was never very likely to emulate the norm defilements Mr. Trump is guilty of. Certainly not as likely as Mr. Trump himself was to seize on and emulate the norm breaking of his Democratic enemies. For my friends, everything. For my enemies, the law. So said a Peruvian dictator. A trumped-up criminal investigation of Fed Chair Jerome Powell is a case in point, though late reporting suggests it may also be a case of Attorney General Pam Bondi jitsuing a president who was turning against her for targeting his opponents with insufficient zeal. Which brings me to a reader complaint. It takes away from your other points, which are typically very well thought out. He means my frequent invocations of the Steele dossier. But why? Why has it become an awkward topic when it stands so perfectly for the slippery slope and unaccountable consequences of our rabid descent into political lying and lawfare? The answer is psychology. The psychology of the elephant in the room. Funny story. During his recent visit to our office, when I asked a highly regarded Democratic congressman to reflect on the Steele dossier episode from the perspective of nearly a decade, he pretended not to recognize the term. Likely registering the incredulity on our faces, he quickly segued to a psychologically adjacent subject, blaming his own party's lawfare for returning Mr. Trump to the White House. 3 weeks earlier, I put the same question to former Obama Chief of Staff Rahm Emanuel, who essentially ducked, saying the question made him uncomfortable. You can read my colleague Barton Swaim's account of our exchange. I submit that the embarrassed unspeakability of this subject isn't only because the Steele dossier proved a hoax, or because it invited an unprecedented intrusion of U.S. intelligence into our domestic politics. It had consequences. By now, no American has received more votes than Mr. Trump. On a population-adjusted basis, by my calculation, only FDR bests him. FDR, whose 4 presidential runs were all blowouts. And there the similarities end. Mr. Trump's status is essentially the inverse of the damage American institutions such as the FBI and the CIA, the press, and Democrats did to themselves. A mere squeal on top was President Biden's willingness to be seen trying to exploit Mr. Trump to wrangle a second term, despite visible senility and low popularity with his own Democratic voters. Through it all, Mr. Trump never obtained a 50% approval rating. Even many of his voters remain wildly ambivalent about him. The public learned something about our mainstream press. It was willing to expose and even exaggerate the lies of Mr. Trump because he was disreputable. It protected and covered up the lives of his enemies because they were reputable. How different our world would be if James Clapper, John Brennan, Mark Elias, Adam Schiff, and their ilk had encountered a press that lived up to its model of telling the truth without fear or favor. I doubt Mr. Trump would be president. And talk about an elephant in the room. For 8 years, Vladimir Putin only heard Democrats promoting false claims about Russia to tar their domestic opponent, implicitly relying on Mr. Putin to keep silent or play along, as in the Hunter Biden laptop episode when he contented himself with echoing a Biden talking point that Hunter did nothing wrong. Mr. Putin knew before Americans did that the laptop was real, that the dossier was a fraud, that the FBI exploited a spurious Russian intelligence document as an excuse for improper actions in the Hillary Clinton email case, which accidentally elected Mr. Trump. All this looks even more ill-starred in light of Mr. Putin's colossal miscalculation over Washington's willingness to tolerate his Ukraine adventure. Remember Mr. Biden's waffling over a minor incursion? Remember his administration's later prediction of a quick Russian victory and recommendation to the Zelensky government to seek exile, and then its flummoxing by Ukraine's successful resistance? A can of worms. Its opening both entices and repels. There's nothing to rebut the above chronology of unfortunate associations except the cowardice of our press and leadership elites to face it. This week, a group of bipartisan elders, including former Republican Federal Reserve Chairman Ben Bernanke and Alan Greenspan, promptly rebuked the administration's intimidation by lawfare of Fed Chairman Powell. Good for them. How often this column called for national security graybeards to speak out against the lawfare and intelligence abuses of 2016 to 24. In hindsight, such a warning would have done double duty. You only have to look at who's in the White House now to conclude the biggest beneficiary of these abuses turned out to be Mr. Trump himself, restored to office by the foolishness and corruption of his enemies. To save public education, look to Mississippi. The state, once a laggard, now leads the nation by many measures thanks to a back-to-basics approach. By Jason L. Riley. Trust in public schools has cratered. A Gallup poll last year revealed that satisfaction with public education had reached a 25-year low, and people had good reason to be miffed. Federal assessment of reading and math skills for 4th and 8th graders released last fall showed the lowest test scores in decades. On reading exams, a third of high school seniors scored below basic, the bottom threshold, and nearly half lacked the ability to perform rudimentary math computations. Progressive cultural fads concerning race and gender have dominated the education discussion, especially since the COVID lockdowns, which turned out to be unnecessary and harmful. These ideological crusades can distract from the reality that too many youngsters aren't learning basic academic skills. The problem is pronounced for children from low-income families who rely on public schools for the educational and behavioral foundation that more affluent families can provide at home. When educators dumb down standardized tests, inflate grades, and ease graduation requirements, they make matters worse for the most vulnerable kids, for whom a decent education may be the only means of social and economic advancement. Many failed practices continue because they are advantageous to the teachers' unions, which control public education, and to the politicians, who benefit from union largesse. For the National Education Association, the American Federation of Teachers, and their thousands of state and local affiliates, the priority isn't student learning, but job security. The same school that is graduating 12th graders with the reading and math skills of 8th graders is still providing solid middle-class jobs for adults. So it stays open and politicians look the other way. The good news is that successful public education models exist, and they're starting to receive more attention. Mississippi's education transformation over the past decade recently received a glowing assessment in the New York Times, of all places. The conventional wisdom, long advocated by the Times editors and other liberals, is that poverty largely explains learning gaps, and that more school spending will result in better educational outcomes. Yet Mississippi, which spends less per student than almost every other state, is outperforming other states with far larger education budgets. Adjusted for state demographics, Mississippi ranks first nationally in 4th grade reading and math, and at or near the top in 8th grade, according to an Urban Institute analysis. Among Black students, it ranks 3rd nationally in reading, and its low-income students outperform all other states. How did the Magnolia State pull it off? It did not do so by relying on some of the most common proposals held up as solutions in education, like reducing class size or dramatically boosting student funding, according to the Times. Rather, the state pushed through a vast list of other changes from the top down, including changing the way reading is taught in an approach known as the science of reading, but also embracing contentious school accountability policies other states have backed away from. While other states have gone in the opposite direction, backing off accountability and lowering proficiency standards, sometimes in the name of equity. Mississippi raised its academic standards, held back third graders who lacked proficiency in reading, and sent literacy and math coaches to help teachers in low-performing schools. Notably, the Times reports that Mississippi was able to muscle through some changes in part because it has weak teachers' unions, which have traditionally resisted accountability linked to standardized testing. Last week, the Mississippi House took up a bill that would loosen limits on the creation of new charter schools and make it easier for families to transfer from one public school to another. In addition, the legislation would create education savings accounts that allow parents to direct education dollars toward private schools or homeschooling if traditional public schools aren't meeting their children's needs. The teachers' unions oppose school choice, but like other changes the state has made, it has a proven track record of success, especially for low-income minorities. Mississippi isn't the only state to figure out that high expectations, quality instruction, and retention policies for struggling students are a recipe for academic success. Florida implemented comprehensive literacy reform in the early 2000s under Governor Jeb Bush. Indiana, Louisiana, and Alabama are using similar strategies to improve education outcomes. Unfortunately, too many states are hampered by teachers' unions, which pursue their own interest at children's expense, and by an education establishment that thinks its social crusades are more important than basic skills. Meanwhile, politicians understand that promising to spend more money on education is an easy way to duck responsibility for poor outcomes. Perhaps a few more Mississippi miracles will help expose the left's deceptions. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the Wall Street Journal on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. ICE, Minneapolis, and the rule of law. Local officials encourage obstruction of federal agents and have now filed a meritless lawsuit. By George J. Terwilliger III. The state of Minnesota and the cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul filed a lawsuit Monday against Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem and other Trump administration officials, arguing that the surge of immigration and customs enforcement agents into the state is unconstitutional. Minneapolis had already sued to prevent the administration from cutting off federal aid on account of its sanctuary city policy. Last week, after an ICE agent shot and killed a civilian who was driving her car in his direction, Mayor Jacob Frey demanded that ICE get the F out of Minneapolis. Whatever the politics of all this, the legal merits are strongly on the administration's side. The notion that a city makes itself a sanctuary by welcoming, embracing, and protecting illegal aliens who are violent criminals does violence to the English language and to innocent residents trying to live and work there in peace. Mr. Frey, along with state and local officials and community activists in other sanctuary cities like Chicago and Portland, Oregon, accused the Trump administration of abandoning the rule of law, while they themselves flout the law by encouraging civilians to interfere with federal law enforcement operations and ordering the local police to stand down. In reality, the deportation initiative is comfortably within the rule of law. ICE agents' presence in Minneapolis is undoubtedly lawful and consistent with the constitutional division of power between states and the federal government. Congress has enacted necessary and proper laws under the Constitution's Article 1, Section 8 that govern when and under what circumstances aliens may enter or remain in the U.S. The ICE agent's purpose in Minneapolis is to exercise that lawful authority as they carry out the constitutional mandate in Article 2, Section 3, that the President take care that the laws be faithfully executed. Neither the Constitution nor any statute provides cities and states any authority over immigration matters, rendering sanctuary city policies legally feckless. They exist only because some officials are willing to exploit the presence of illegal aliens for political gain. Moreover, the Constitution's Supremacy Clause, Article 6, Clause 2, forecloses Mr. Fry and his fellow exploiters from directing how ICE and any other federal enforcement officials perform their duties. Chief Justice John Marshall ruled in McCulloch v. Maryland, 1819, that the states have no power to retard, impede, burden, or in any manner control the operations vested in the general government. These aren't abstract legal theories, they are fundamental precepts of our federalist system. By engaging in anti-federal law enforcement rhetoric to whip up political support, Mr. Fry and local officials elsewhere have incited violent attacks on federal law enforcement agents, courthouses, and equipment. The mayor didn't drive Renee Good to her fatal encounter, but he paved the way with rhetoric signaling to his residents that impairing federal operations, even by obstructing them, wasn't merely allowed but encouraged. Common sense would dictate restraint in the anti-ICE rhetoric, lest it occasion any more civilian interference with lawful enforcement functions with tragic results. But Mr. Fry has kept it up. At the Monday press conference announcing the lawsuit, he vowed that we will continue to push back with everything we've got and praise the heroes who are standing by the neighbors that they love, and added, "One thing I can tell you for certain is that we aren't backing down." That the ICE agents were lawfully present in Minneapolis and entitled to carry out their lawful functions without local interference doesn't justify the agents' use of deadly force. An investigation to assess whether the use of deadly force was legally justified is necessary. The FBI has a role under law. But by excluding the locals, the FBI has now occasioned the public to question who should be doing that investigation. A homicide occurred within the state's authorities' jurisdiction. That gives those authorities a vital interest in the investigation. If the agent's conduct was part of or related to his official duties, then he would be immune under the Supremacy Clause from state prosecution. If he acted outside those duties, he could lose that protection and be subject to state jurisdiction. In either case, constitutional standards for use of deadly force by a law enforcement officer will be the measure of his actions. Sad to say, the FBI's reputation for probity and integrity has been impaired by years of questionable leadership and is in need of repair. Excluding the state authorities from an investigation where the law gives them co-jurisdiction over the conduct of both the agent and the deceased doesn't enhance that reputation and may harm public confidence in the investigation's integrity. Welcoming state law enforcement authorities to participate seems a more sensible course, one that could sidestep jurisdictional wrangling by local politicians looking for a new fight with the administration. The Constitution gives the President discretion to direct immigration enforcement. The deportation crackdown has solid legal roots and initially enjoyed strong public support, especially after the lawless pandemonium of the Biden open border. But the administration also needs to take care to do it right and not squander political capital by acting outside the public perception of common sense, even if it is acting lawfully. Could it be that the push to post deportation numbers is resulting in overzealous efforts to harvest low-hanging fruit by snatching aliens at work in farms, at restaurants, and on construction sites, while dangerous criminals remain at large in less visible places, where the electorate remains closely divided, with independents prone to shifting allegiances? The rules of politics may impose a more demanding standard than the rule of law. Just as the federal agents' lawful presence in the cities isn't a justification for the use of unnecessary force, objection to their presence on policy grounds proves no justification for civilian interference in their operations or for local officials to leave them bereft of local law enforcement help when that occurs. The administration has a duty to protect its agents from violence. If state and local officials mean what they say about the rule of law, they will draw the line there and provide protective support, even if they disagree with national immigration policy. The failure to do so will encourage more interference and violence and necessitate stepped-up measures by the administration to protect federal personnel and property. Rather than ratchet up their rhetoric, state and local officials have a responsibility to dial it back and make clear that if the rule of law is to prevail, no level of government can tolerate efforts to impede and interfere with lawful government functions. You've been listening to a reading of the January 14th, 2026 issue of the Wall Street Journal. Your reader has been Corrine. Thank you for listening.